So a little over a year ago, I made this video called It's Time to Move to Linux. And like the central core concept was really my frustration with Windows and the direction they've taken and how forceful Microsoft has been to force their vision of what a PC should act like onto everybody.
No! No, please, no, too sexy! No, the bambino! No, it's too sexy, please!
But I must.
Like, it seems like they're just more and more interested in making you use your computer like they want, making you use the services they want, the programs that they want, the way that they want. Let's move your files to the cloud. Would you like to set up OneNote? Would you like to set up OneDrive? You know, let's have you log into one system that we can now track you everywhere. I think that video just resonated with a lot of people because there has been a growing kind of general frustration that I think a lot of people have with Microsoft. That video ended up being by far the most watched video on my channel. And again, it's not even close. And I do want to, again, disclaimers, get those out of the way. I'm not the first person who's made this kind of video. I'm probably not one of the first 1,000 people who has made this kind of video. But I do think that there has been this trend of people who are looking to escape. We're looking to escape from the large-scale tech approach of trying to give you a lot of free services, which then siphon off your data in order to train other services, to advertise to you, to really abuse that relationship and access to our computing platforms. You know, forcing AI into everything, forcing cloud into everything, forcing subscriptions into everything. There's been a lot of pushback on that lately, and a lot more people have become interested in stuff like Linux, stuff like self-hosting services, pulling away from cloud services, getting out of subscription services, right to repair. It's really been taken off, I think, in the past couple years. So I think one of the funniest things that's come out of this is just, you know, recently PewDiePie has become basically a full-on open source self-hosted activist. And like his past few videos have been increasingly just like, I gotta get away from Google. I gotta get away from Microsoft. I want to do all my own stuff and have control. And that's really, I think, influenced a lot of people to give Linux a good solid look. Now, whenever I talked about moving to Linux at that time, a lot of people responded also to tell me that I was an idiot and that I would be back and that Linux was terrible and it doesn't work. And so, you know, I figured it's time to make this follow-up because it's been a little over a year since I actually moved my primary desktop computer over to Linux. And not that anybody asked, but I'm going to pretend like you asked. How's it been going? So when I first started off moving to Linux, the first thing I tested was Mint, and Mint is a great operating system. I ended up moving away from it fairly quickly and going to Fedora because I found out what I wanted was a bit more up-to-date kind of kernel and software and access, and Fedora gets access to the new stuff very quickly, whereas Mint is a little bit more tested and polished and put together, I feel like. Fedora has pretty good polish, but sometimes you're going to be on the bleeding edge. Not as much as Arch, but you're going to be toward that side of things more often than not. And every video on this channel since the It's Time to Move to Linux video has been edited on a Linux desktop. And that turns out that video editing is one of the easiest things to move to Linux because DaVinci Resolve has excellent Linux support. And I even run an NVIDIA GPU. And a lot of people will say, oh, NVIDIA GPUs don't work very well, but I have had no problems at all with anything with my GPU. And that has been most of my experience over the last year with Linux, is that it's kind of just boring and reliable and positive. It's just a computer. And that may make this video a bit boring and positive because, again, that's been my experience with Linux. I do what I want, and it, for the most part, just works. I have not had larger difficulties on Linux over the past year than I have when I've tried to use Windows over the past year, because I have increasingly had more technical glitches with Windows 11 than I used to have with Windows. I've recently had a weird thing where programs, whenever I start them, put icons on my desktop for some reason and stuff just sometimes just breaks. And I had a virus earlier this year on my Windows laptop, whereas again, I haven't had that happen to Windows in forever. But with Linux, I haven't had that much drama. There hasn't been a lot of, oh my gosh, my stuff's broke, I have to reinstall, I have to redo stuff, I have to spend 3 hours finding a resolution. It just hadn't been like that. I use my computer to do stuff that I use a computer for. I can edit videos, I can edit photos, I can do a little bit of sound recording, screen capping, I can play video games, I can use spreadsheets, I can send email, I can surf the internet, I can do basically anything that a computer does, and I haven't ran into a lot of problems. Running Linux hasn't actually changed much of my day-to-day experience using my computer. It just remains just a computer. I think the biggest change is more internal, the knowledge that my computer isn't data mining me, it's not spying on me. I can do whatever I want, and I'm not worried about having apps forced on me or having AI integrations forced on me. It's not embedding ads into the start menu or the login screen. And again, it's not keeping records of my activity and sending them to somebody else. I don't have settings getting overridden by whatever, Windows wants me to have, because that stuff kind of happens sometimes on Windows where you think you've removed Internet Explorer or Edge, or I've turned off Copilot or Cortana or whatever they're calling it this week. And lo and behold, here it is again. If I don't want to update, I don't have to run updates. I get to do what I want to do. And that has been a big shift, because now I find myself starting to get more and more annoyed when software doesn't let me just do what I want. Whenever I'm on my phone and some app pops up and says, hey, you haven't used me in a week. And I'm like, yeah, so leave me alone. You're my app. Don't tell me when I need to use you. One of the other things that's kind of hard to explain to people until they use Linux a bit is the software delivery system is so smooth in Linux that you get very comfortable just using the software delivery that's built in and not having to go out and download files off the internet to install. And for people that aren't familiar with what I mean, it's more like using a phone with an app store, except for it's not an app store exactly, it's a repository, right? And so the repository is a group of packages that are already pre-built to run on your particular flavor of Linux. And instead of having to go out and find a program to install, you figure out what program you want, you go to the Software Center, and you just click on it and install it there. And it's, again, more like what Microsoft's trying to do with their Microsoft Windows Store. It's more like, again, Play Store on Android or the Apple Store, where, again, you don't download programs and then install them. The programs are kind of found within the system itself. Now, you are still downloading stuff, right? Because, again, you download the files, but you aren't installing an exe that you've downloaded from some third-party website. It's more contained than that. And that has kind of started to change my perspective on software, because sometimes if I need some third-party utility or something, there's this open question on Windows, like, is this going to be a virus? Like I said, I got a virus earlier this year, and now I'm more wary of that, because on Linux, I don't really do that. I don't go and download random software from various websites. It's all coming mostly from either Flatpaks or the Fedora repositories or something, where there's no guarantee you're not getting a virus, but it has a feeling of a bit more of a cohesive software delivery. It's very easy. Now, I know I've mentioned a couple times, I do still use Windows on my laptop because I have a Microsoft Surface, and that is a Microsoft assembled hardware, whole integrated thing. And there are Linux distributions that have been put together for it, but there's still a couple things that they haven't gotten hammered out because the Surface uses some very specific types of parts, specifically like the camera and stuff, where there's just not good driver support yet. So I do still use Windows on it because I love the form factor of the Surface. It's just a fantastic portable computer. With that, like I said, Windows, I think one of the things that running Linux for a while has taught me is that people do sometimes gloss over some of the difficulties that you encounter on Windows. And I don't have experience with Apple stuff, but with Windows specifically, there are still hiccups. There are still tech things. There are still things that don't always work. But I think we've gotten so used to that with Windows, as far as the things that are difficult on Windows, we have grown accustomed to. And so that is just the way things work. And we no longer view that as a problem. Whereas on Linux, anything that goes wrong because it's novel, we sometimes interpret that as Linux doesn't work. You know, one of those things is like when you install Windows, you need like licenses, key, you need an ISO, all this other stuff. And so installing Windows takes a while. I had to reinstall my Surface because, again, I got a virus. So I wiped the thing, went to reinstall it, and the Surface requires a special version of Windows built for the Surface. And trying to find the ISO to download it, and then having to get it on the right type of, you know, USB device so that the computer would recognize it and get it to go into the installer. And I kept on having problems where that installer was failing. And I mean, it took me actually over 2 days to get my Windows reinstalled. And then, like, I couldn't find like my recovery media, I couldn't find my product key, my Windows license. And so like I ended up having to like buy a new Windows key just because it wouldn't take on my Surface. And so that was kind of frustrating. Whereas like when you install Linux, it goes real fast. You download the thing, you burn your media, you install it, and that's just it just done. There's no activation, there's no key. It just works, you know, to use the phrase. And like I said, that is one of those things that I find is very easy to gloss over, is that we are used to Windows quirks. You're not used to Linux quirks, so they seem like problems. And Linux certainly has quirks, but it's no more of an issue for me now than Windows ever was. I've gotten used to, well, this is just the way it works. And it really has driven home. Windows is by no means perfect software. Windows has glitches. Windows has hangs. I have to reboot stuff sometimes. Well, Linux, I actually probably don't have to reboot nearly as often as I do Windows. You know, I haven't measured, and that's just purely subjective, but that's been my experience, is that it really doesn't have any more technical hang-ups than Windows does. Some other things I'll comment on that, again, you hear a lot with people being scared of using Linux is command line terminal. They really don't want to have to fudge with a bunch of config files all the time and settings and digging through terminal commands and stuff like that. The vast majority of stuff that you do on Linux, you can do through a GUI. You actually, in my experience, need very little terminal or command configuration stuff. Now, you will occasionally do that. I end up doing that more and more as I get more comfortable with doing it, because it turns out that sometimes that is easier than trying to hunt through a GUI where you're trying to find a file. Well, in a terminal, you're just usually going straight to things. You're going straight to open the file and edit it. And even that, like, this is one of those areas where that is considered like a weird quirk of Linux. But in Windows, I've had to edit like registry commands. I've had to download and install like gpedit to edit my group policies because I want to turn something on or off. And that is somewhat of an obscure way to do things, right? Editing registry keys and group policies and stuff like that. That's not something that your average, you know, user is going to be messing with. But on Windows, you got to do that stuff. But that's the way Windows works, and everybody's kind of used to it. All of a sudden, you tell somebody to go edit a config file, and they freak out like, oh, Linux is some backwards, archaic thing. It's really not. It's just a little different. I think another place that comes from is legacy. So Linux originally was mostly used by very technically proficient people. And so when you ask those people how to do something, they've been using Linux for a long time. And the way that things used to work 15, 20 years ago in Linux was purely, or not purely, was largely command line driven. And so they're going to give you that method because that's what they're used to. And a lot of the tutorials that you find online are written by people who have been using Linux for 15 or 20 years. And that's the way they think, and that's the way they do things. I think one of the flaws is when you're new, that becomes, well, this is the way to do things, and that's the only way to do things. So even though modern Linux desktop environments have the ability easily to navigate to and open these files, that you can edit them in a windowed environment, in a GUI environment, it still doesn't feel like that because all the tutorials are very command line oriented. But again, that's more of a legacy issue rather than that's the way it has to be. So more and more, whenever I show people stuff on Linux, I'm trying to show them, hey, here's how you can do this in the file browser and stuff like that, just to kind of break that problem of people thinking that you have to do it through a command line, because you don't have to. Sometimes that's just what people know, and that's the way they've done it for 20 years. There's usually alternatives. So another big hot area is always gaming support. That's been, a huge issue, and over the past couple years has gotten very, very good with Steam and Proton and that sort of stuff to really smooth a lot of the bumps in running games built for Windows on Linux, and it works really, really well. It's also been a very visible issue. Again, with PewDiePie being a big gamer, with some ordinary gamer, out there, he's been, pushing a lot of this stuff. And that's been a lot of people's main concern, because historically one of the areas that just didn't work very well. But it does work pretty well these days, to the point where, like, I went out and pulled a list of, like, the top games for PC on Metacritic. And if you look at the top 10 games on Metacritic that have been released in 2025 on PC, all of them run on Linux. Most of them ran first day out of the box. They would just run. And so that's kind of the modern Linux gaming experience. New games pretty much just work. Now, there have been like Monster Hunter where it's not great, but from what I've heard, that's not great no matter what computer you're running it on. But everything is supported. It's nothing to do with the platform anymore. Now, the one gotcha is competitive multiplayer, but competitive multiplayer usually isn't a Linux problem, it's a developer problem, where the anti-cheat software, you can make that run on Linux, but they don't. They don't want it to work on Linux because they are concerned with cheating. Has nothing to do with technical capability or support. It's just they don't want it to work. But if you're not doing competitive multiplayer, essentially, it's just almost certainly going to run on a Linux computer without much issue. And performance is quite comparable. I'm not going to say that it's perfectly comparable to Windows, because it might be within 5%, but in my testing, it was pretty close. And in most tests I've seen, it's pretty close. And Linux just gets better and better over time because, well, people, they want it to work. And so since it's open source, people can just work on stuff and they can make stuff work because they want it to work. And if you know software, you can do stuff on Linux because it's open. Even like when I pulled the data, the most recent game was like System Shock 2, the re-release, and that had only came out like the week before, and it was working just fine. Again, stuff works. It works generally the time it's released. You don't have to wait for support for most games. Now, there might be some bugs here and there. I can't guarantee that every game is going to work day one, but guess what? On PC, on Windows, that's no different. Occasionally PC, they got to push patches out first day and stuff. That stuff happens. Now, I don't want to try to lie to you and tell you that everything has always worked perfectly and I've never had any problems at all, but I am trying to put in perspective, there are problems on Windows too that you will have. It's just different problems sometimes. For me, the biggest pain point has been CAD. 3D modeling is difficult and it requires specialized software, and most of that is built for Windows. A lot of it will sometimes work on Mac, but not all CAD programs really even work on Mac very well. I had Fusion 360 running for a little bit, but Autodesk updates that thing all the time, and it feels like every time they update it, they intentionally break support that people have built scripts to install it. That feels very intentional because it's every time they do something, it magically breaks the Linux support that people have worked very hard to get going. So with that, there's not been a great substitute, although some people go to like cloud CAD software like Onshape or something. Free CAD isn't quite there. So that is kind of the one thing that I wish worked better. Everything else, my video editing, my photos, my gaming, media, everything has now been updated to the point where it just kind of works. Even more recently, one of the problems I mentioned in my first video was photo editing not being great, RAW support for my camera. But recently I was actually able to get RAW support on my camera working in Darktable. So now I can even do RAW conversion, and all that's been fixed. And so it's been an evolving thing. And that's one of the big advantages about Linux is over time, Linux typically just gets better and better. And you never have to worry, for the most part, about Linux moving against the user because they don't have any incentive to make people not like it. They don't have incentive to make things not work. All the incentives align to make things work better. So I would expect over time, support for programs to be broader, support for gaming to be broader. I think companies in the near future, maybe in the next 5 years or so, you will see more and more companies starting to turn their attention to make Linux compatible versions of their software because it's becoming a bigger user base. I mean, look, it's still very tiny. You're talking maybe 2 to 5% of people run a Linux computer, but as that grows, there's more people that might be interested in a Linux version of software. DaVinci Resolve's doing that, and it kind of cascades, it snowballs a little bit. Gaming support's getting there, video editing's getting there, and so once you get to some of the major hurdles covered, you know, with Europe and some of their countries moving to Linux systems, you're going to have people that want to provide software because there's now money to be made. You know, one company that I think I'm going to send them an email to like bug them about it is Affinity. So Affinity is one of the main competitors to Adobe with Photoshop and Illustrator because they have their own designer and photo editing software, and it's much cheaper and it's perpetual license, stuff like that. So getting that on Linux, I think, would open up a lot of people who are held up by Adobe Photoshop because their stuff is pretty good. It's not Photoshop, it's not Illustrator, it's not going to be 100%, but it's pretty good, and it's commercial. And so that, I think, would be something big for people. I think getting good CAD support would bring in a lot more people, and to me, beyond that, it gets really niche as far as the softwares that aren't kind of there. I think DaVinci Resolve, there's a couple of codec things that I would like to see hammered out, plug-in support, stuff like that, but for the most part, I don't need that. And that does make me feel like Linux has a bit of a bright future ahead of it. I feel like it's growing. I feel like it's moving in the right direction. For me, it has just gotten better and better and better. And so that has been my experience over the past year. Is it perfect? Nothing's perfect. There is no perfect. But it's been really good. And it feels like it's moving in a better direction, where Windows consistently feels like it's moving in a worse direction. So I really don't regret at all switching my desktop over to Linux. And probably the next computer I buy, when it's a laptop, I will probably find one that plays well with Linux. I don't know if it'll be like a framework or something like that, because my laptop's still chugging along pretty good and I see no reason to replace it anytime soon. But that's where I'm at. Like, I am in it enough now where it's like, I may just be moving that way for everything, always. My server runs Linux. My desktop runs Linux. I've only got one computer running Windows left. So anyway, that's my experience with it. If you've got any feedback, comments, suggestions, feel free to leave them down below as always. I appreciate it. Thanks.